Okay, so today we're doing chapter 17 some more. So as a quick recap, last class we got through the Renaissance, we got through the Reformation. We still have a lot to go, so we got to run. We finished up with the Reformation. So quick review. Reformation is primarily focused on what topic? Religion. And the dominant religion in Western Europe is Roman Catholicism. And people have lots of problems with Roman Catholicism. All kinds of corruption, all kinds of abuses of power, all kinds of things like that. We have a laundry list of people. That are attempting to make changes in the church. Some are successful, some are not. Some get burned at the stake, some don't. It's a crapshoot. Where we start today is with the effect, the outcome of the Reformation. This is a map from your book. The purple is Catholic. The green is Lutheran, which is started by Martin Luther. The bluish is Anglican, which is started by Henry VIII. And the yellow is Calvinist, which is started by John Calvin. Take a quick second and look at the map and see what you see.
For the quiz, would reading the book be helpful? No, I know. I know that it's helpful, but really helpful. If you fell asleep last class and don't know what you're even talking about, would it be helpful?
All right, so what do you see on this map? There's still a lot of Catholics. Good. That's what you should take away from this map. What else, Nick?
The Scots decided to be jerks and become Calvinists instead of Anglicans.
They're not jerks. They just don't like the English. They're allowed. James?
Which looks weird. I mean, there's one of the yellow and a lot of purple.
Which makes sense when you remember that John Calvin goes to Switzerland to establish his religion.
Oh, but he was there because it started.
Yep. Nick, what else?
The Holy Roman Empire is no longer Catholic fully.
Right, the Holy Roman Empire is no longer fully Catholic. What else do we notice? Emily? That's not a dumb question at all, and to be honest, it's so not a dumb question that I don't really know the entire answer. The Holy Roman Empire has honestly never made a lot of sense to me. It's a combination of Central European provinces and kingdoms under the leadership of somebody who is closely affiliated with the Pope most of the time, typically coming from one of Europe's major noble families. I think most often the Habsburgs, but there's definitely some other people that jump in there. But honestly, I don't really get them apart from that. It seems like it's really just a loose alliance of kingdoms that sometimes all agree on something and sometimes don't like each other much at all. And again, beyond that, I don't really know that much about them, so it's definitely not a dumb question. No. No, it's really just what's contained within that red line. All right, so good. You caught the major points of this.
There are Christians in Africa.
There are Christians in Africa. And that's going to spread more and more as time goes on. But in Europe, following the Reformation, despite all of those reformers that we ran through, all of those people with complaints about the religion, and people like Luther and Calvin and Henry who start new versions of Christianity with new beliefs, despite all of those efforts, when you look at the map of Europe, or at least the religious map of Europe, 100 years later, most people are still what? They're still Catholic. Even with all the corruption, even with all the abuses of power, even now with a buffet of alternative religions to choose from, most people stay Catholic. Why? All right, it offers stability. It's been around for 1,000 years at this point. Why else? Emily? Excommunication? Yeah, that's still a very realistic threat. But it's only a realistic threat if what? If you believe in it. Sahil? The Catholics have adjusted? Okay. Yeah. All right, and one of the things we're actually going to talk about is how the Catholic Church responds to the Reformation. And you're right, they do make some concessions and they do make some changes, and they make themselves look a little bit more appealing, and they admit that they screwed up. And so, yeah. Nick, what else?
That's what I was going to say. The Catholic Church realized that they were screwing up bad, so they went in.
Yeah.
Screwed up, guys.
Paul?
Was that partially shaded section of the
Here?
Yeah.
That just means it's a combination of Calvin and Catholic. And so the green and purple in Transylvania is a combination of Lutheran and Catholic, which you would imagine gets fairly messy. But you're right. I mean, the biggest reason why this is still predominantly Catholic is it comes down to personal belief. And so even if you struggle with your church, even if you struggle with your pastor, even if you struggle with the people in your congregation, this is still how you view the world and life and death. This isn't something that you change like you change your clothes. This isn't something that you change like you change your diet or your house. This is what you fundamentally believe about the universe. It takes a whole lot of frustration to make somebody cast all of that off, especially like Emily brought up, the idea of excommunication. And not just excommunication, but the belief that if you were Catholic and you voluntarily leave, you still might be sentencing yourself to hell for all eternity. Do you think most people want to risk that? No. Because those are things that people truly did believe before. And so if you truly believed that because you were Catholic, you actually had a shot at heaven, but then one day you're like, oh, I'm so mad at the Pope, I want to quit. It's like, mad at the Pope, hell. Which one do I pick? Not really a tough choice. So that's a large part of the reason why Catholicism remains dominant. It's asking a lot of people to completely abandon their belief system. It's great that Martin Luther was willing to stand there and say, okay, excommunicate me, I accept it. That's not something most people are going to do. All right, so let's talk about what the Catholics do to bring people back. They do a lot. They actually convene a meeting called the Council of Trent. And at that Council of Trent, the Pope gets together what's called the College of Cardinals. The cardinals are the top officials in the church just below the Pope. And the Pope gets them all together, and he's like, all right, we got a problem. People are leaving the Catholic Church. We need to do something about this. What can we do? And so at this meeting, at this council in the city of Trent, they come up with a series of proposals and resolutions. The very first thing they do is they validate the Pope's authority. They say, yes, the Pope still is God's right-hand man on earth. Why would they need to validate the Pope's authority? Tarina? Partly that, yeah. Sahil? Good. Because of all the Protestant religions that did not acknowledge the Pope, the concern was that people might start to think, the Pope's really not that big a deal. Pope's really a figurehead. He's not that special. So the very first thing the Council of Trent does, and they say, no. The Pope is a valid spiritual authority. He is the valid spiritual authority on earth. If the Pope says something, it's right and God likes it. But then they apologize. They admit their guilt for selling people's way into heaven with indulgences, for allowing priests to be corrupt, for, taking money, becoming wealthy, abusing their power, excommunicating people all over the place, all of it. They apologize. They say, we are sorry, we screwed up. You should have been able to expect better of us, and we have let you down. we have not been doing God's work. That is huge. That is huge for a religious organization to say, we screwed up big time and we are sorry. Not to try to pass it off as like, well, you know, we were trying to do something and you just didn't understand it, so now we're going to do something different. Or it's because of you people that we're going to have to change. They own it. They're like, nope, we screwed up. We lost control. We abused our power, and we are sorry. But you all really need to come back to the Catholic Church because, let's be honest, the Catholic Church is the only right form of Christianity. So, come on back, doors open, but if you don't come back on your own, we're going to strongly encourage you. And this is where you see the persecution and suppression of what the Catholics consider to be heresy. Now, heresy is a fun SAT vocab word. What is heresy? Nick, you can't answer every question all the time. Everybody else is like, crap, Nick's not talking. What's heresy? Alana? Doing something against the church. Excellent. So we want to suppress those that are doing things against the church. Like who? Martin Luther. Way to get back in there, Nick. Good job. Who else? John Calvin. All of those people. Anybody who's attacking the church. Well, we haven't gotten the specifics yet. But in general, we need to shut those people up because they're a distraction. We don't want Catholics or people that used to be Catholic thinking that it's okay to be anything other than Catholic. James.
Did they burn them at the stake?
We're going to get there, but yes.
Yay.
All right, so people you need to know. Pope Paul III is the Pope at the time of the Catholic Reformation, or what's sometimes known as the Counter-Reformation, because they're trying to counter or stop the Reformation. So Pope Paul III is the guy who's in charge. He's the guy who starts the Council of Trent. He's the guy whose authority is being validated. He's the guy who's making the apology. Kind of a big deal.
Wait, why would he apologize?
Because of all the wrongdoing of the church in general.
Oh, I thought other people apologizing to the Pope.
No. It's the church and the Pope apologizing to all Catholics.
Oh.
Sorry, I might not have made that clear.
Big thank you letter. No, it's a big sorry letter. Sent
Yeah.
to everyone.
Oh yeah, gigantic apology card. Probably like 6 feet tall.
That'd be like big.
Hard to mail too. It's a lot of postage. All right, and just to clarify, they didn't write a big actual thank you card. Okay. That's how urban legends get started. All right, so other things that they do. They kick out all of the corrupt priests. Well, not all of them necessarily, but a lot of them. So a lot of the rural pastors and priests that had been abusing their power, taking money, impregnating nuns, things like that. They kicked them all out. And they instead create a new religious order of Catholic priests. And that new religious order of Catholic priests come to be known as the Jesuits. Now, we'll say that again just so you get the pronunciation, because looking at that word, you might think it's J-Suites or J-Suits or something like that. It's not. It's Jesuit. Jesuits are uber priests. Let me give you some sense of what they had to do to become a recognized Jesuit. By the way, the Jesuits are started by this man, Ignatius Loyola, and you will see to this day colleges across the United States named after him. You have College of Loyola in multiple states across this country. And that's going to be the hallmark of the Jesuits, education. Education is going to be the focal point of the Jesuit development, because that was one of the things that was really lacking in a lot of Catholic priests. Remember, they couldn't read, which makes teaching the Bible really hard. And so the Jesuit education looks something like this. they would do the same kind of like, K through 12, learning all kinds of things that you guys do. And then they would go off to college, like many of you will do, and they would get the equivalent of a bachelor's degree, an undergraduate degree in religion, divinity, theology, something like that, something to do with God and faith. But then they graduate and go get a job, right? No. Then they go to grad school, and they get a master's degree, or the equivalent of a master's degree, again, in divinity, or theology, or religious studies, or something like that. So then they graduate, right? They go start preaching? No.
Go for a PhD.
They have to get their doctorate, their PhD in divinity or theology or religious studies. And then, and only then, when by that point they're probably like 30, and they've been in school for pretty much their entire life, only then are they allowed to go and begin the work of preaching the Word of God to other people. It's for this reason that the Jesuits are often the Catholics that are on board the boats that go and explore the New World, that find the routes to India and China. And so it's the Jesuits that people in the New World and India and China are first exposed to and lead a lot of the first mission trips to convert foreigners to Christianity. These are people that could talk intelligently about their faith, that could read from the Bible firsthand, which obviously in Christianity is kind of a big deal. These are people that were hopefully far less prone to corruption and took their faith and their job much more seriously. Now, for those that were not convinced by the apology and were not taken in by these attempts at positive reform, the Catholic Church also starts the Inquisition. And the Inquisition is where we get into that persecution and suppression. The Inquisition is the Catholic Church's attempt to forcibly bring people back to the Catholic faith. And they have a number of wonderful different techniques to do that. And I feel like we've told you about them at some point or another. But just to run down the laundry list again. Oh yeah. Some of these would simply be arrested and thrown in jail for a while, give you some time to think about your decision, whether or not you want to be a Protestant or a Catholic. Some of them might be slightly more painful, pull your fingernails out, put you on a rotisserie over a fire, slow cook you until you say, yes, I want to be Catholic again. They had other fun things like, the Iron Maiden, where they confine you in a small chest with spikes on the inside, forcing you to stand very, very still, otherwise you get poked in a lot of uncomfortable places. Other fun things like making small incisions in your abdomen and then slowly pulling out your intestines. All kinds of fun stuff like that. They have lots and lots of other fun things, but yeah.
Did they do this to the people that they met, like in India and all that?
No. That's obviously not going to be a great conversion technique for the first time. The Inquisition methods were typically reserved for Protestants in Europe, people that were actively rebelling against the Catholic Church. Not for, get off the boat and shine and be like, hey, who wants to be a Catholic? Here's the chair. That's obviously not going to win a lot of people over. Emily? You would think, but torture has proven to be very, very effective in getting people to do what you want them to do. And so what a lot of these methods were intended to do, and again, you can look at this from two perspectives. And the one is the very cynical, power-hungry perspective, that they were really just trying to control people and make them do what the Catholic Church wanted them to do. But the second perspective is that from a spiritual standpoint, the Catholic Church truly did believe that if you were anything other than Catholic, you could not be saved. And so in their mind, torturing with the hope of bringing you back to the true faith, that torture was justified. Even to the point of killing somebody if their death resulted in them being saved and coming back to the true religion. So, doing something like that abdominal incision and slowly pulling out your intestines, I mean, you're not coming back from that. You can't just shove it all back in and stitch it up and go home. But the hope is that, somewhere around hour 2 of seeing most of your intestines lying on the floor and knowing that you're going to die and dealing with the excruciating agony of feeling all these slippery things inside your stomach coming out. Who's hungry now, by the way? The hope would be that just out of the desire to make it stop, that somebody would say, okay, fine, I confess, I was wrong, I don't want to be a Protestant, I want to be a Catholic, please, dear God, forgive me. You are forgiven. Welcome back into the fold. And then you get a quick, painless death, decapitation, something like that. The pain stops, and from their perspective, you have now been saved. That's how they justify this. So it's not simply terror for the sake of terror, although for some that may have been their motivation. But for many in the church, it was the honest conviction that this was the right thing to do, by whatever means it took to bring people back to the Catholic faith. Again, not arguing that it was right, just that that's their rationale for what they're doing. Nick?
They really wear red uniforms.
Sometimes. Last thing you need to know, Edict of Nantes, or Edict of Nantes, puts a stop to a lot of this persecution and religious conflict. The Edict of Nantes, which I think is written 1568, 1578. I feel like there's a 1, a 5, and an 8 in there someplace. And does not in the Inquisition. It offers freedom of religion throughout Europe. So being a Protestant is no longer illegal. You can no longer be punished, arrested, tortured for being a Protestant. Nor can Protestants legally attack Catholics in countries where Protestantism is the dominant religion. So the Edict of Nantes attempts to rein in all of this religious conflict and turmoil and put it to an end. Now, if any of you have learned anything about Ireland, you know that this didn't entirely work. But it does seriously cut down on the number of acts of religious violence in Europe. You betcha. Yeah, even with, I think it was last month, there was another referendum on whether they wanted to continue to separate from the United Kingdom and whether there should be a state-sponsored religion, either Catholic or Protestant. So yeah, it's still going on. Nick?
The Inquisition, where did it operate? Did it only operate in Spain?
Oh, no, because you've got Protestants all over the place. So you would have, little Inquisition headquarters set up all over.
So like secret police?
Yeah, kind of.
In your house?
Yeah. When I took my trip last year to, I forget what country it was in now. I want to say it was in Portugal. We actually saw like a house in this little town on the coast of Portugal that had been set up for the Inquisition, and it had the crossed keys over the door to show that it was being used for that purpose at the time. So, yeah, they've got places all over. All right, any other questions? No. All right, Sharina hath spoken. All right, next topic, scientific revolution. And again, these things are not happening in isolation. Because of all of this religious turmoil, it now becomes easier to question scientific knowledge as well. Because, and you may not be aware of this, most science prior to this point in Europe, bless you, was based almost entirely on religious beliefs and or logic and common sense. So I'm going to take you way, way back to pre-Roman times, pre-Egyptian times, way, way back to the earliest view of the universe, when there were no scientific devices and math hadn't even been invented yet, which many of you were jealous of. Man's earliest view of the universe and his own world was this: that his earth was flat, that you could fall off the edge, that this flat earth was encased in a bowl upon the inside of which the stars were painted, and that the sun rose and set in the same position every day because it was circling this flat earth. If you look at the Greek myths, who's the sun god? Apollo. And Apollo rides his chariot, which is the sun, across the sky every day. But what happens when it's nighttime? Where does Apollo go? He goes into the underworld. And there was actually a tunnel that opens up in the earth, and he rides his sun chariot into the underworld.
The underworld.
And so that's where the sun goes. The sun goes under the earth until it comes out the next day in pretty much the same spot. That's a very logical interpretation of your natural surroundings. I mean, I don't know what other idea you would come up with, because when I go outside and I look around, I don't go, oh yeah, the earth's definitely round. I'm like, earth looks pretty flat. Especially when you grow up in the Midwest like I did. It's really flat. You see the sun come up every day and go past you. So logically you would assume the sun revolves around me. Maybe not me specifically, but the earth. Now, contrary to what you learned in elementary school, where Columbus is the first one to prove the earth is not flat, false. The Greeks, the Egyptians, the Mayans, everybody had pretty much figured out that the earth was round. Right. But they knew the earth was round. But we still don't have the scientific and technological capabilities of proving where the earth is. So we fall back on logic and religious teaching. And logic and religious teaching at the time would indicate that if the earth is made by God, and the earth was made last, and on the earth, what was the last creation? Man. Actually, it was woman. But, not to split hairs. What is clearly God's most prized possession? Not only the earth, but man. So, again, if we're going to go through this logically, if we picture the universe as a giant display case of God's creation, where does the earth go? Dead center, spotlit from above and below. It's not going to go up in some dusty corner and be like, hey, my last and greatest creation, after which I will not create a thing. Pfft, we're going to throw you in a drawer someplace. No, it only made sense that the earth would be at the center of everything. And so this is the early view of the universe. It's known as the geocentric theory. Geo meaning earth. Earth-centered theory. And you may have heard of the guy who came up with it. His name was Aristotle. Smart guy. And so from the time of Aristotle until the 1500s, nobody questions, at least in Europe, nobody questions this geocentric theory. It just made sense. The sun revolves around us. The moon revolves around us. The few planets that you can see with the naked eye revolve around us. The constellations revolve around us. I mean, who's going to argue this? Nobody. Until you get to the scientific revolution, and the power of the church has been reduced enough that scientists can at least attempt to question things that the church has for centuries said are true. So we're going to run you through a laundry list of scientists. You ready? Good. Nicholas Copernicus is the first person to challenge the geocentric theory, and he proposes an alternative. Now, if geocentric means earth-centered, his idea is sun-centered. Anybody would guess what his theory was called? Mari? Heliocentric. Good. The heliocentric theory. That in fact the sun is the center of the universe, and everything revolves around that. So did he get it right? Really? Sun is the center of the universe? Not quite. The sun is the center of the solar system. Not even of the galaxy. We're just one of the many, many arms of the spiral Milky Way galaxy. but it was an improvement. Now, how did he prove that? He proved that by mapping the positions of the constellations in the sky at night for 20 years. Talk about a party animal. Why 20 years? Well, it probably took him several years just to find consistent data, because the constellations move from night to night. You know, the constellations that you can probably easily find, Little Dipper, Big Dipper, Orion, they're never in exactly the same place twice. We find out later it's because of the tilt of the Earth's axis and its orbit. But that's part of why it took him so long to come up with conclusive data. Now, he publishes it just before he dies because he knows nobody's going to believe him. Because they're going to look at all his math and go, I don't get it, but that doesn't look like the universe to me. Plus, it goes against the teachings of the church. And when you go against the teachings of the church, who do you typically make very, very mad? The Pope and God. So it takes a long, long list of scientists, like Galileo, who builds a telescope to study the heavens more closely. It takes a partnership between Tycho Brahe and Johann Kepler to prove that planets' orbits are elliptical and not perfectly circular. They also witnessed the birth of a supernova, which confirms to them that the universe is in fact constantly changing. Things are being born and things are dying. Nick?
Who was the Kepler?
Brahe. And then finally Isaac Newton, who was the Einstein of his generation. When Einstein says something, what do people typically do? They're like, I don't know, dude. Show me your work. Is that how people treat Einstein? No, if Einstein says something, what typically happens? They're like, okay. If Einstein came out and said, the sky is not actually blue, it's actually purple, people would actually pause and go to the window and be like, I can kind of see that, yeah. Okay. Einstein said time travel is possible. And out of that is born an entire genre of fiction, based on nothing more than the belief that Albert Einstein can't possibly be wrong. Isaac Newton was the Einstein of his generation. He had already had so many other discoveries that by the time he actually endorses the heliocentric theory, people in England are like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Newton. We believe that. He gets knighted by the Queen of England, gets buried in Westminster Abbey. You can still go see his grave alongside many other famous scientists who become famous after Newton helps their discoveries be, acceptable. And for as smart as he was, he's still actually kind of a humble guy, because he famously says at one point, if I have seen further than other men, it is only because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. Now, he's not talking about actual giants. This isn't Harry Potter. He's saying that the only reason that I was able to prove that these theories are correct is because all these other guys came before me and did the hard work of coming up with the idea and getting the data. The reason I'm up here at the top getting recognition for this is because I am standing on their shoulders. I am building off of their work. Kind of a cool statement. Now, again, he gets all the statues and the credit, but, whatever. So you slowly see a change in people's scientific understanding of the universe. And a lot of this is predicated on a completely different approach to knowledge. The old approach was, well, if it makes sense logically and if the church agrees with it, it's probably true. The new approach is the scientific method. Hypothesis, testing, analysis, retesting, analysis, retesting, analysis, retesting, 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 until you can finally establish a conclusion. We're going to apply these same principles to people's understanding of the human body. Now, just like with Aristotle long, long ago, there was another Greek who established the basic understanding of human anatomy. His name was Galen. Galen was a doctor. He was a physician. And he really wanted to learn how to treat his patients better, how to work with them more effectively. But there's a slight problem. He doesn't really know how the human body is put together, because at the time it's a sin to dissect a human body just for the sake of curiosity. It was considered disrespectful. It's the same reason why today you don't go to graveyards and dig up graves. It's just rude. But this obviously poses a problem for Galen, who can't figure out how the body's put together. So he does the next best thing. And again, we don't have the scientific method yet. So what do we base our ideas on? Religion and logic. So let's work our way through this. Who made man? God. Okay. What else did God make? Animals. So, logically, animals are put together the same way as people. Because God probably just went to Home Depot and got a whole bunch of parts to make everything. It's a big Home Depot. I know. That's probably like, their regional center. So Galen, who can't dissect humans, instead goes through a barnyard full of animals, dissecting cows and horses and sheep and goats and pigs in order to learn about our anatomy. Are there some similarities? Yeah. Are there some pretty important differences? Oh, yeah. But because we can't dissect human bodies yet, this becomes the foundation of medicine for over 1,000 years, at least in the West. Now, India, China, the Arabs, they didn't have as many of the same issues. The West, again, was a little bit slow. And so it's not until a man named Andreas Vesalius in the mid-1500s, it's like 1548, 1553, sometime around there, he decides to sneak into graveyards and dig up corpses and cut them open in his basement in order to figure out how human beings are actually put together. It's a little disgusting. Right, so you got to get the fresh ones. Now, we had also talked about how Michelangelo and Da Vinci back in the 1300s had dissected corpses for the purposes of their art. But they were doing it for the sake of art, not for the sake of medicine. And so while there probably had been people throughout history that were privately cutting open dead bodies for whatever reason, none of that knowledge had come back to inform the medical opinions of doctors. And so that's what Vesalius is trying to accomplish. He's trying to revolutionize medicine. Nick?
Did people like Vesalius go as far as to take birth food, living people, kill them, and then dissect their bodies?
Let me get to that. So eventually Vesalius publishes his findings, proving conclusively that human anatomy is very, very different from animal anatomy. And, once the initial outcry from the church and the rest of society were like, dude, what's wrong with you? Once all that dies down, people really can't argue with him, because all he's got to do is roll out a dead body and be like, look, we do not have 4 stomachs like a cow. We are different. And people are like, oh, you're right. Good point. You're still creepy, but good point. Now, the only problem with the stuff that Vesalius discovers is what? Okay, they're all decaying, but if you get a really fresh one, you can, But graveyards. They bury him on Sunday, he digs them up Tuesday night. They're dead. That's the problem. It would be like trying to learn how to be a mechanic by looking under the hood of a car but never starting it. You would never see how the pieces interact. So what do we need to do next? Cut open a live person. So, I give you William Harvey.
Oh my God, he did not.
Well, why would I be talking about him next after that whole build-up? Now, to this day, and granted I have not spent my entire life searching for this information, but I've spent a couple hours, and I still can't find it. I've heard two different theories of how Harvey accomplishes the task of observing a still beating human heart. Because he was primarily concerned with understanding human circulation. Because there were all kinds of bizarre theories about blood and oxygen and how it interacts in the human body. And again, when all you have is logic and common sense, you come up with some understandable but wrong stuff. So like if you look at your arm, there's a whole bunch of blue tubes running around just below the surface. Logically, what is this? Don't say blood. We all know that blood is red. This is blue. It's oxygen or water. This would be your body's transport system for either oxygen or water, because we all know that oxygen and water are blue. It makes sense. You breathe. Oxygen's got to get to your body somehow. You drink. Water's got to get to your body somehow. Blue tubes. Yay, blue tubes. Now, there was also sky, river, ocean. I rest my case. But again, when that's all you have to go off of, you're clear. James?
If the blue veins on your hands are blue and contain water, how does the water get out?
You go to the bathroom.
Yeah, but will it just somehow just run down your body and then just go out?
Yeah, it's like a plumbing system. Pour it in the top, it comes out the bottom. Okay. There were also theories that, much like the oil in a car, which obviously they didn't have, I'm just giving you that as a comparison, that blood aged and would become dirty and messy and yucky and not functioning as well and would need to be discharged from the body. And there was a theory that the reason that the heart beat so much was that it was actually a compression chamber. And so that when you ate, the food was actually sent into this crushing machine, pulverized, and turned into blood. Now, they're not dumb, they're ignorant. And there is a massive difference between the two. Ignorance is when you don't know any better. Dumb is when the facts are right there and you still can't put two and two together and make chicken. Wait for it. Okay. So these are not stupid people. These are very, very intelligent people. But these are people that did not have access to the knowledge and technology that we do today. Now, just like people 500 years from now will be making fun of you all for skinny jeans, they will also be looking back at our understanding of medicine and astronomy and going, how on earth did they not know that you cure cancer by doing this? I mean, really, it's obvious. And you're going to tell me the fastest they could get anything to move was like Mach 8? Really? Speed of light, not that hard to break. I jog that fast in the morning. At some point, people will look back at us and go, wow, they were stupid. And hopefully they will have some, fairly enlightened teacher that will tell them, no, they weren't stupid, they were just ignorant. And then proceed to make fun of them anyway for their skinny jeans. It's only fair. William Harvey is attempting to disprove the logic-based understanding of physiology, how the body is put together and runs. Again, I've heard two versions of this story. I don't know conclusively which one is true. Option one, he became a court physician to a wealthy nobleman. That nobleman was out riding his horse hunting. The nobleman fell off of his horse and cracked a rib, and the rib was in danger of puncturing his heart or other vital internal organs. And the only way to save his life was to cut open the chest cavity and remove the broken rib. At which point, his court physician, William Harvey, would have a clear view into his beating heart. And then there's some story I heard about how they affixed like a metal plate with hinges so they could like open it up and close it. You don't want that to get dirty in there. So right, that's option one that I've heard. Option two is that William Harvey may have accosted homeless people and or criminals and dragged them back to his, basement laboratory and done experiments on them. I don't know. Again, like I said, I can't find conclusive evidence one way or the other. But in either case, William Harvey does an experiment that comes straight out of a Wile E. Coyote cartoon. Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner? What? No. I said he's going to do an experiment straight out of a cartoon. Okay. Now, you all know in cartoons, when you have the hose running from the water spigot on a house, and if you step on the hose or you crimp it, you get the gigantic cartoon bubble of water that backs up. Okay, well, Harvey theorizes that since I have this lovely exposed beating heart, if I took a small piece of string and tied off one of the four main arteries heading out of the heart, hypothetically speaking, if the heart is creating blood, the blood should be coming out of the heart. So if this is the artery and the heart's up here, and I tie my string off here, where should our cartoon bubble show up? Below the knot or above the knot? Above the knot, right? So if the heart is beating and creating blood, and we tie a knot on the artery coming out, that should cut off the flow of blood, and we should get this gigantic cartoon bubble of blood that backs up, right? So he does the experiment. And he ties off one of the arteries with a piece of string, and he gets the gigantic cartoon bubble of backed up blood. But guess where it is? It's below the knot. So the heart's up here, the knot's here, he gets his bubble of blood here. What does that mean? The blood's coming back into the heart. Blood is being recirculated, not just created. Revolutionizes people's understanding of physiology. And then the guy probably died from a heart attack. But, it's all in the name of science.
So he killed the nobleman, saving him?
I don't know. Again, like I said, I have not found conclusive evidence of which story is true. But in any case, he does an experiment where he observes a beating heart and does the whole knot thing and whatever. Yes? Well, this is the problem. He publishes his findings, and the task of proving it is obviously much harder than Vesalius. Vesalius can roll out the dead body. Harvey's like, can I get a volunteer from the audience, please? Not going to go so well. So, scientific revolution, scientific method, test and retest, challenging church teachings, getting rid of religiously based and logic-based science. Emily? Combination of the weakening of the church during the Reformation, exposure to new ideas via the Renaissance, and a willingness of some people to believe that there might be a better way. So just kind of that basic entrepreneurial sense of, I want to go try this for myself. Okay, next topic. Absolutism. As people move to cities and leave the countryside, as the feudal system breaks down, as exploration begins to happen and the wealth of the New World comes flowing back into Europe, the power of the rulers in Europe skyrockets. They now have fabulous amounts of wealth. No feudal system to limit their power. And because religion is still fairly important, they come up with a concept that gives them basically carte blanche, free reign to do whatever they want. Now, a couple terms that you need to know. One is absolute monarch. We've had monarchs before. Monarch's a king, or a butterfly. But in this case, a king. kings typically have a fair amount of power. Kings typically pass their power along to their offspring. The difference between that and an absolute monarch is an absolute monarch has absolute power. No limitations. Nobody they have to ask, nobody that they have to get advice from. If they want to raise taxes, they can do it. If they want to start a war, they can do it. If they want to execute somebody for having a haircut that they don't like, they can do it. And the reason that they can do that is because they believe they have something called divine right. Divine meaning godly or perfect or holy, that they have a God-given right to rule. Again, scientific revolution has not totally changed society. We're still going to rely a little bit on logic and religion. And this progression's not really hard to follow. Yes, sir? Very, very similar, yeah. Where if we believe that there is an all-powerful God, then clearly he has the power to decide who's going to be born where in society. I was not born to Princess Diana, which is why I'm not married to Kate Middleton and about to become the next King of England. Apparently God didn't like me that much. He liked William better. That would be the logic. I know, seriously, tears on both sides. And so because God chose this person, not only did he choose them, but what did he also, in effect, do? Well, because he chose this person to be in this position, what is he also, in effect, doing? Sahil? All right, he's also then endorsing their offspring to have this position later, whoever that offspring would end up being. But what about during the course of that ruler's life?
What about being the Pope? Because, like,
Same thing. God-given appointment, if we're going to follow this line of thinking. Emily?
So like if God shows the ruler, so would you have
Exactly. If God chose the ruler, then logically God also is totally fine with whatever that ruler is going to do in their lifetime because God already knew he was going to do it. So if, for example, this absolute monarch decides to raise taxes on the peasants to a level that causes many of them to starve, do they have the right to complain?
No.
No, because clearly God knew this was going to happen when he made this person the king, so he's okay with it. If the king then wants to use those tax dollars to build his 6th palace instead of taking care of the people, should the people complain? No, because clearly through this divine right to rule, God's okay with it. And if God's okay with it, should people complain? No. Isn't this a great time to be the king? Emily?
But if things like raise taxes and build the hospital gets
Yeah, but we don't worry about that.
really?
That's splitting hairs. Yeah.
What year are we in?
1500s through the 1800s. So, there's a whole bunch of people. Mari? I mean, divine right, mandate of heaven, all of that stuff, it's taking the teachings of your religion and applying it to politics. That if God really is in total control, then clearly I was put in this position for a reason, which means God is okay with whatever I do. It's a twisting of theology to suit your purposes. And you see it in societies across the world. Now, you're going to have a whole bunch of absolute monarchs throughout Europe during this time period. Here's some of the highlights. Charles I, he's King of England. He abuses his power. He starts wars that are unpopular. He disbands his parliament and refuses to take any advice from the people. He allows his Catholic wife to run roughshod over the Protestant faith of England. And so he is eventually forced to fight a civil war against his own people who wanted to kick him out of power because they got so tired of him. That civil war was led by Oliver Cromwell, who, after overthrowing and executing the king in order to bring democracy to England, decides that democracy is taking too long to develop and seizes the throne and makes himself a dictator, who then, and this is where you may want to watch the Horrible Histories video that's linked on the Vision page, Oliver Cromwell proceeds to get rid of fun things like dancing and Christmas because they were too frivolous. Frivolous. Louis XIV in France does much the same thing. He's known as the Sun King, S-U-N, so like sun in the sky, because he truly believed that he was the focus of France, that he was the life giver of France. He fights any number of wars, which is scary considering he became king at 5, as in age of, and held power until his 70s. So he had quite the run. One of the fun things about Louis XIV is his house. We'll come back to this, don't worry. This is the front door of Louis's house, otherwise known as the Palace of Versailles. Yes, that is real gold. No, people don't try to steal it. Did that take care of most of the questions? Okay, good. This is his bedchamber. You'll notice the railing. That's because his morning wake-up was attended by usually 20 to 40 noblemen, all hoping for a chance to get the king's attention and maybe, you know, get a political appointment someplace or just become his good buddy. So they would all be there before he woke up, which meant they had to wake up really early. And this was all by design. He wanted to control the upper class like this. He made people wait on him all the time. The Queen's bedroom has much the same features. The Queen also, and this is a pretty common practice, Queens had to deliver their babies in front of a live audience just to make sure that nobody was switching babies out and that the baby that was actually born to the Queen was in fact the child of the Queen and was therefore the legitimate heir. So imagine going through labor with a crowd, you know, eating their popcorn. Like, yeah, go, push. This is called the Hall of Mirrors. This is the party room in the Palace of Versailles. This entire wall is covered in mirrors, which obviously, it gives you an infinity effect. So as you're staring into this wall, it mirrors the other half of the room, which is already pretty large, as you can tell by the number of people walking abreast down the hallway. The mirrors double the visible sense of space. And then you look at all the chandeliers and all the light, the mirrors reflect all of that. The sense of grandeur in this hallway is just ridiculous. Yes? Yeah, these are my pictures.
2 questions. Why did Louis XIV not get disposed and executed like Louis XVI?
Great question, because as much as he took advantage of his position, he also made France one of the most famous countries, well, probably the most famous country and the most powerful country in Europe. And so as much as people might have criticized him for how he spent money, they loved the fact that he was vaulting their nation to the top of Europe's food chain.
And also, why was the palace in Versailles not totally looted and destroyed when the French Revolution happened?
There were parts of it that were. But, you know, then Napoleon comes to live there. There's actually a portrait of him in one of the other 50 or so bedrooms. So the wall of mirrors is here. This wall is windows looking out into the backyard. So let the tour continue. This is the backyard, part of it. This is the Hall of Mirrors, just the second level. This is more of the backyard, which extends all the way back to here. 1,500 acres in total in his backyard. You'll notice the lake. And you notice the fountain. The fountain is one of 500 fountains on the property. If they ran all the fountains at once, they would have deprived the entire city of Paris of running water. So what they typically did was station servants throughout the gardens at little hiding spots. And so as the king or the queen would go out for their stroll and, you know, go through the gardens, servants would be turning on the fountains ahead of them and turning off the fountains behind them. What if they turn around? They turn them back on. Does that answer the obvious question? Okay, good. So this is the long view straight off the back of the palace. To the left and to the right are private gardens. This one is just for the queen. Notice another lake. There's a similar looking one, although obviously with a different layout on the right side, which is the king's private garden. So king's private garden, queen's private garden, giant backyard. And yes, you can go wander through all this stuff. It's really kind of cool. Unless you get caught in a downpour while you're there, in which case it's not fun. Not that that happened. But again, that's an example of what you can do as an absolute monarch, which is pretty much whatever you want. Similar stories, Maria Theresa is the most famous of the absolute monarchs in Austria. She's noteworthy because obviously she's a woman. And up to this point, we've been talking about just men. It's also noteworthy because the guy that's next on the list, Frederick the Great of Prussia, no, that's not a typo. It's not supposed to be Russia, and I screwed it up. It is actually a country, Prussia. It's not a country anymore. But Frederick the Great, who was the ruler of Prussia at the same time that Maria Theresa was the ruler of Austria, he gets the idea in his head that obviously a queen is not fit to rule because she's not a man, so it won't be that hard to take over her country and make it part of mine. And then he gets his butt kicked in 2 successive wars, those wars being the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. And then lastly, and this is a gentleman that we will spend more time on in the next chapter, Peter the Great of Russia is going to radically alter Russian culture, coming off the heels of the Mongol invasion and then kicking the Mongols out. And he will begin to make Russia much more like Western Europe. As you read chapter 18, you're going to notice that he takes some drastic measures using his absolute power to change Russia's culture. He doesn't like the fact that Russian men wear long beards like the Mongols did, so he famously has public ceremonies where the Russian nobles are invited to the palace and he takes a long pair of scissors and cuts off their beards. He also does a lot for, I wouldn't say a lot, he does one thing for women's rights, because typically women in Russia, when they were married, the father of the bride would give the groom a whip just to keep his wife in line. Peter the Great decides that that's really not a good practice, and so he stops that one. Would have been better had he given the whip to the women and said, here, make up for lost time. But, you know. Okay, so we good here?
No.
No? Okay. The 30 Years' War is one of the last major religious conflicts. Even though we had the Edict of Nantes, that doesn't stop all of the religious fighting. But the Peace of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War, and again is another attempt at limiting religious persecution throughout Europe between Catholics and Protestants. The 7 Years' War, fun note on that one, it's actually one of the first world wars, long before we really have the actual world wars. Because the 7 Years' War extends not just across the European nations, but to their colonies overseas. You might recognize our part of the 7 Years' War. It's the French and Indian War. That was part of this global conflict at the time between a war that began as Austria versus Prussia and turned into Austria and Prussia and England and France and several other countries. Emily? Land. Trying to conquer each other's kingdoms, conquer each other's colonies, gain power, gain resources, the usual. We good now? Okay, we're on the home stretch, almost there. Here's your quick tour again. By the way, if you ever get the chance to go to Paris, take the time to go see the Palace of Versailles. It's well worth it. Okay, so now that we have discussed the absolute abuse of power by these monarchs, we're going to talk about when Europe finally gets fed up with absolute monarchs and demands a change. So the Enlightenment is a time of political revision, where Europeans begin to change some of their philosophies on government. Because prior to this point, what's been the dominant form of government in Europe? Monarchy. I mean, there's no question about it. Nobody stops and thinks like, hey, should we have a monarchy? Like, you just do. And it's such a part of your culture that when Oliver Cromwell overthrows King Charles, there's actually a lot of people that are like, you know what, we beat him in the war, let's just put him back in power. And Cromwell's like, what? They're like, yeah, well, you know, he's the king. We always have a king. And when Cromwell's like, no, chop his head off, and then takes power and gets rid of Christmas, and then he gets kicked out, you know what the solution is to the question, what do we do with our government now? Yeah, they're like, hey, let's go find King Charles' son, who's hiding out in France. Let's bring him back. And Charles II is like, I have one condition. They're like, sure. What's your condition? I get to do whatever I want. Absolute power. They're like, yeah, sure, fine. Go for it. It's such a part of their political DNA that for hundreds of years, nobody ever questioned this. You just have a monarch. That's why even to this day, the royal family in England, there are so many people that just love them and can't get enough of them. Now, there's also some that just wish they would go away. But there's a fair number that are like, man, we almost wish the royal family had more power. Bring back the monarchy. The Enlightenment, though, is when monarchies really begin to be seriously questioned. And people begin to wonder if human beings might not actually have something they consider inalienable rights. You've probably heard this phrased another way. Inalienable rights would be rights that cannot be taken away. For example, the right to life, liberty, no, not pursuit of happiness, property. The initial expression coined by John Locke is life, liberty, and property, because the pursuit of happiness is really vague. Life, liberty, property, in John Locke's opinion, are the basic fundamental rights of all human beings that should not be able to be taken away by a government. So you should not be able to be killed by your king just because he doesn't like you. You should not be able to be enslaved or imprisoned just because. And you should not have your stuff taken from you just because. That's what they considered inalienable rights. Now, to make sure that doesn't happen, this guy, Baron de Montesquieu, says, you know what, why don't we break up this power structure? Let's separate it. How many different ways do we need to separate this bad boy?
5.
What seems like a good number?
5.
3. And we shall call these divisions a legislative branch of power, an executive branch of power, and a judicial branch of power. Sound familiar? Yeah, because we stole it. We took Locke's idea of inalienable rights, we took Montesquieu's idea of the separation of power, and we wrote it into our Constitution. That's how far-reaching the effects of the Enlightenment were. It not only influences Europe's government, it influences ours. Now, there's also people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau who believe that government is actually a contract. Contracts have two parties, and both parties have to uphold their side of it. Now, government before this point wasn't really a contract. It was, king does whatever he wants, and you suck it up and deal with it.
What did he do?
Social contract. So Rousseau says government is actually more like, or should be more like, a contract. The government promises to take care of the people, and in return, what do the people promise to do? Follow the government. But because it's a contract, what happens if one side breaks the agreement? They die. The contract is void, and there are consequences. So if the government stops taking care of the people, guess what the people now have the contractual right to do?
Riot.
Rebel and riot. That's a revolutionary way of looking at government, that people have rights. Now, there are some people that disagree. This gentleman, Thomas Hobbes, grows up during the English Civil War between Cromwell and Charles I. And he sees death and violence and mayhem and chaos. And that pretty much convinces him that mankind is evil and brutish and savage and can't be trusted alone in a room for 5 minutes. Which leads Hobbes to believe that an absolute monarchy really is the best form of government, but only if you have the most cruel, vicious, corrupt person as the absolute monarch. Because imagine that for a moment. If you had a cruel, vicious, corrupt monarch, is anybody going to step out of line ever? No. Imagine if you had a cruel, vicious, corrupt teacher who could do whatever they wanted to you in class in terms of assigning homework, penalizing you grades, not giving you credit for something you actually did well on, just arbitrarily fail or pass people. Would you ever piss off that teacher? You would be on your best behavior at all times. They would never have to tell you to put away your cell phone. They would never have to tell you to stop talking to Allison. I totally just pulled that name out of a hat, don't worry. You would have no problems at all because people would be terrified of that ruler. But not everybody was that cynical. Some people were much more cynical. François-Marie Arouet, known by his pen name Voltaire, had a long, long list of people he thought were stupid. The church, women, blacks, Jews, and I know I'm forgetting a couple, but that covers most of the people he would have come into contact with. He also didn't have much use for the upper class because he thought they were snobby and elitist. And he didn't have much use for the lower class because he thought they were, stupid and uneducated. And probably a little dirty. So here's the weird thing. Voltaire is the first person to promote the ideas of freedom of speech, freedom of religion. The man who hates everyone and thinks everyone is stupider than he is promotes the ideas of free speech and freedom of religion. And he actually famously says at one point, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." And you got to imagine at some point somebody looked at him and be like, "Wait, really? You hate everyone, and you would be willing to die to protect their right to say something that you don't agree with?" Yes. All right, good for you. I guess you're not as much of a lost cause as we thought, Voltaire. Well done. You do have a heart.
Thank you. Now,
It's 2 sizes too small, much like the Grinch, but whatever. And then lastly, Adam Smith, a man you may have heard of. Lead singer of The Cure. I'm just kidding. Adam Smith is actually the creator of the idea of capitalism. And the reason we put him in the Enlightenment is because at its heart, capitalism says the government should not get involved in the economy. That the economy, much like society, should be run by the people. All right, in 3 minutes, I'm going to give you the commercial revolution. You ready? Awesome. Okay. One of the problems of all this trade and exploration is that Europe's economy actually gets so rich it fails. All of the gold and all of the silver coming back from the Americas inflates the value of gold and silver so much that it loses all value. It becomes shiny rocks, much like the gravel outside in the courtyard. And none of you go diving over each other to pick up the rocks in the courtyard. That's how much gold and silver come back from the Americas. So much comes back, it loses its value. It becomes so common, it's not worth anything. It's like pennies. You flick them down the hallway. You throw them in the trash. You collect them and put them in piggy banks and then lose them. They have no useful value. A lot of that happens, again, because of the American gold and silver, but it also happens because that gold and silver is being spread throughout all of these colonies. which leads us to a new economic definition of the world. Core areas versus dependent areas. Core areas are the places with the money and the ability to manufacture goods. Core areas are the places with the money and the ability to manufacture goods. Dependent areas are what they sound like. They are dependent on the core areas. So, the American colonies are dependent on who? England. Central and South America are dependent on who? Spain. Core versus dependent. Who has the power? Core. Who gets to make all the decisions? The core. Who's going to get screwed one way or the other? The dependent areas. But not just the colonies will be at a disadvantage, but also peasants. Farming during this time period becomes commercial, or as it's incorrectly spelled on the board, chimerical. Farming becomes something that's dominated by the wealthy. They start making farming a business instead of a way to survive. That's bad news for the peasants because it takes far fewer peasants to grow food if you're doing it as a business. What's shocking about all of this is that even with the inflation, even with the core versus dependent areas, even with kicking peasants off of their farms, the level of material wealth for the average person in this time period is 5 times higher than at any other point in previous history. There is more wealth available for everyone. So even if you are poor, you are much richer than poor people used to be. That's still not much consolation because you're poor, but whatever. We're also going to see that as part of this commercial revolution, exploration will now involve many, many more countries. Last thing, this is important. And by important, I mean test-worthy. Some countries will take a very different approach to exploration. Places like the Netherlands and England will have private exploration, meaning not financed by the government. Whereas places like Spain and Portugal do all of their exploration with government funding. If you read the chapter closely for this part, you'll begin to understand why that was important. All right, you can get the rest online. If you want copies of the audio, you can come get it during Flex tomorrow morning, whatever.